So some years ago, the FAS decided that they really didn't want to run a kind of mini Smithsonian of all the collections, and that the collections should really serve the teaching and research mission of the university. So we in History of Science, and I in particular, got a kind of mandate or threat that said, use it or lose it, about the collection of historical scientific instruments. So we decided we would use it, but that meant getting some control over its inventory, what we had, getting it out from a tiny room at the basement of the Science Center. It meant building a new wing of the Science Center and raising the money to do that. But we now have a collection that actually works. We actually know what the 20,000 objects that we own are. We finished an inventory. And we've begun to do some really exciting exhibits involving undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, junior faculty, senior faculty, visiting artists. And it's been terrific. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing, and it will link naturally to what Laurel Ulrich will be telling you about with Tangible Things, because it's one of the exhibit that's up, our temporary exhibit that's up now, that is very exciting, and if you haven't seen it, I hope you will. So we have in our permanent collection an astonishing group of objects. They began back in the 17th century as a kind of Wunderkammer, a chamber of wonders, that had all, a unicorn's horn and the true cross. I mean, it was all sorts of things that were gathered from all around the world of dubious origin, and it burnt down in the 18th century. And so late in the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin was given the task of assembling a new set of instruments, and among others. And while he was doing some other things in Paris and London, like helping to establish the United States, he also collected instruments for Harvard. And among the objects that came to us in that period of the late 18th century was the Grand Orrery, which is a model of the solar system, and in true Enlightenment fashion, you can peer in through the windows and see the clockwork mechanism, understand its rational motion through that. There's many stories about this. We've begun to make films about different people interpreting it, an astronomer, historians of science, furniture makers, clock makers, to use it as a kind of prototype object for multiple interpretations. At the far end, at the distal end of our time period, when you come up towards the present, there's the control of the cyclotron. Now, one of the problems that we have in collecting is some of the instruments of modern physics are big, like really big. And cyclotrons can't be fit into that, and they're radioactive junk that's left there. So after it was torn down on Oxford Street, or while it was being torn down on Oxford Street, I decided that the thing to keep was this control panel. This began in the 30s, one of the early cyclotrons in the United States for fundamental research. And it was then brought to Los Alamos for the Manhattan Project. And in exchange, Harvard demanded and got the government's promise that they would build a new cyclotron for Harvard after the war was over, which they did. And this became the control panel for that new object. It was used at the frontiers of modern physics in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There were various disasters. There was a huge hydrogen explosion on Oxford Street that was catastrophic. It killed one person, injured others. When a liquid hydrogen tank exploded, they found many amazing new pieces of knowledge. Then, when it lost its edge on the high energies, it became a medical facility where it treated, by the use of highly tuned proton beams, hard to treat cancers in the eye and brain. And you can see, if we had more time, we could go through this as a kind of material palimpsest and see switches and keys from the 40s and the steam dials from the 50s, all the way up through these early Apple computers and telephone switchboard-like technologies that you can see there. We kept everything exactly it was on the day that it ceased operation in 2001, except for patient photos, which for privacy reasons we had to take down. But in between the several centuries of science, this collection was the cabinet of instruments, the formative teaching apparatus body for science at Harvard. And so all the electrical apparatus and all of the experimental psychological instruments. We have an annex. We have a relationship also with a medical collection that's quite extraordinary, that's never really been exhibited properly. We have an amazing collection of birthing instruments, for example. It's an astonishing collection. We have 7,000 radio tubes, one of the biggest collections in the world. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do with this is to make it into a laboratory of exhibition, to not try to compete with the Liberty Science Museum or the Boston Science Museum. We can never do that. We can never make child-proof, climbable exhibits. We really need to be able to do things that are not for necessarily just for experts, but for where we can try new forms of exhibition and speak to the kind of exhibition that we would most want to have, to try things that other people can't try because they're too ambitious in the depth of their scholarship, or they used multimedia things that are still being stabilized. One idea, for instance, that I've wanted to pursue is multiple readings of the same object. So this is, for instance, a screenshot from one of the films that you can see of the Grand Orrery. And eventually I'd like it to be possible to go through the collection, or the main part of the collection, looking at material culture, or looking at just at the scientific results, or just at optical devices, or just at glass and brass instruments, to have different ways to travel through the same space on different levels. Another problem that we've had, and we've spent several $100,000 solving it, is to make the collection accessible to everybody, not just the Department of History of Science, not just Harvard, but anybody can log in now and see any of our 13,000 objects that we've classified. You can make virtual exhibits. You can make slides for your classes. You can find out, you want to look at all the binocular microscopes that we have, or all the devices made between 1760 and 1780. You can do that. So that creates a new way of using the collection. I would consider it to be the first level of a virtual presence for the collection. It's taken us many years, but it's just a first step. Among other things, it's how to integrate films and audio and other things. On Waywiser, this program, which you can get to either directly by typing in Waywiser or through the History of Science website, if we have a student or faculty paper that we want to put on, we can do that. We can add film clips if someone makes a demonstration device to show how something works, or in a debate that uses these. We had a musical performance in the collection a couple of weeks ago. Alex Redding, who I see here, was a participant in that, using the music of a French, what began as a French movement called spectralism, and then having it discussed. A singer performed it. The Firebird Ensemble was involved. There were people from musicology, from physics, from history of science. We have students now in their courses producing exhibits themselves. And as part of the product of the course, they'll actually produce a show. So we had one, Janet Brown taught a course called Nature on Display, about how the history of biology and evolutionary biology was shaped through its exhibitions and shaped public understanding of what that was about. Another course, methodologically very intriguing, was about the history of the scientific fact, which has been a subject of some inquiry in history of science in related areas. So these are just sort of shots from that student-driven show. We had an exhibit that our colleague Mario Biagioli organized with students, junior faculty, and faculty, in which, in the old days, people had to make a model for a patent. It didn't have to work, but it had to be three-dimensional and instantiated in that way. And so many of those have been destroyed as we've gone over towards schematic illustrations and text for patents. But we had an exhibit of patent models and what you could learn about the understanding of technology and intellectual property through these material vestiges of that period. We've had an artist come in, Rosamund Purcell, who recreated the Wunderkammer at Worms, and in an incredibly beautiful exhibit took over our temporary gallery. So we have two galleries, one on the first floor, which is our sort of gracious, more long-term permanent display, although it's changing in ways I can discuss, and then a second floor, which is rotating every couple of months, in which we're using to do musical performances. I hope some mini theatrical things like the theaters of electrical power that were popular in the 18th century, temporary exhibits like this one on patent models, the one that's up now that Laurel will tell you much more about, and so on. One of the parallels that we've organized to the Tangible Things show of the collection that Laurel and Ivan Gaskell have organized around the idea of the history of collecting at Harvard and what it tells us about the nature of knowledge is a graduate course where the students are combining film, audio, text, and objects. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, I think, at this moment in display has to do not so much with just using the virtual space as a kind of replicant or a trace of the originary physical objects, but something that actually goes much farther than that, that mixes film and audio and has different paths through the material. And so we've got 4 groups. One of them is on Cold War science and looking at chemistry and astronomy and ham radio as linking popular cultivation of a certain kind of scientific orientation in the era of the Cold War and then accelerated in the period of Sputnik. So this show called Thinking Things is also heavily using this novel platform which is being developed largely here at Harvard called Ziga, where you'll be able to take in your iPad and then move back and forth between the physical objects, maybe some geolocated accessible things, and we're also mounting film projects. So for example, one of the subgroups of the class is looking at B.F. Skinner, using B.F. Skinner's archives, using the film archives of his laboratory, and embedding and combining film elements. That's one of his original operant conditioning chambers over here with the pretend pigeons. And here at film, this is a film still, it's part of a film that's playing that's from his laboratory of the work that they were doing there. But it's going to get more elaborate still as they're constructing sort of boxes that will come down over the visitor and replicate the kind of cut-off experience of the pigeon. And so you'll be shifting back and forth between the sort of phenomenological position of the pigeon, the experimenter, and the spectator. So there are lots of things you can do. Thanks, I see Stephanie Kennan is here. She helped us raise some money to get the screens and the technology that we needed to really try out really new things like Ziga, which we're modifying the platform through the course. So it's not just plugging into an existing technology, but making a new technology to be able to do this kind of thing. Here's a shot from the chemistry section of the Cold War. We have amazing things in this collection, and we're adding to them through the wonders of eBay. And borrowing things like ham radio. I had a student recently did a PhD on ham radio in the Cold War and how it creates a kind of space, a gendered space of the ham shack in the period of the Cold War, an isolated male-oriented space. So there's the idea, if I were to sum it up, would be to do 2 things. One is to make the body of resources that's used as an input to scholarship to include more than text. So that I'd like the next generation of students and of scholars to be able to think that they're not just using archives or archive traces or interviews, but also accessible is the material world. And whether it's ancient material world or early modern material world, Katie Park has done, and Susan Dackerman did a wonderful show on paper instruments, essentially using print as a technology of inquiry in the early modern period. Or whether it's contemporary, objects that are so familiar that they barely can be thrown out of their current usage into an object of inquiry. So, and you use film and photographs and illustrations and pattern models and artistic works as sources for what we're trying to do. So that's one, the input into scholarship. But the other is perhaps less expected, and that is that our students and we now are used to using images, moving images, and all sorts of different ways. We go back and forth between Wikipedia and YouTube many times a day, and many of us find these kind of prosthetic thinking for us now. And I want our students and my colleagues and me to be able to use these technologies as part of the scholarly output of what we're doing. So it's both. It's expanding the genre of sources, but expanding equally the idioms in which we're able to express ourselves. Thank you.